Hello, everybody, and welcome back. As you may have seen by now, my colleague, Sam Hockley, is in charge of the music. And the risk we're running on this day-long summit is that, like so many shows you go and see these days, the intervals are possibly more fun than the actual show. So we're going to try our hardest this afternoon to make sure that we live up to the music in between the sessions. Sometimes in those conversations before you get started, you hear or learn something amazing, and Ambassador Power, Samantha Power, just sent me a note just as we were settling in saying, just got to go and get my daughter on the bus. I'll be back in a minute. And the reason, Samantha, why I think that is sort of so amazing to me is I realized the last time, after you sent me that message, the last time I think I saw you, you'd just written A Problem from Hell, and you were just going to work for a young, promising new senator from Illinois as his foreign policy advisor. And so it's one thing for you to have done all these grand things, being, ambassador to the UN and another. It's a whole other thing that you've got a daughter who's getting on a bus. So a long way of saying it's very nice to see you again and welcome.
You are marveling at the right thing. As a perennially single person, deep into my 30s, the fact that I'm married and have two children is a miracle. But the bigger miracle is that my daughter's getting on a bus, a school bus, in the age of COVID, and it was like a ghost bus. There were about 3 kids on the bus. Most parents, I don't know what to say about my parenting, but most parents showing more restraint, I suppose, than me. But we are making a go of it here in Massachusetts, which has been, we had a really rough go in the early days, but sort of got a grip. We have a Republican governor, which helps a lot because we'll probably talk about polarization, but it means that the state is not nearly as divided. You have Democrats who are inclined to follow the science and the public health expertise, and Republicans don't, they want to follow Trump. They're not quite sure, but that we have a Republican governor. And so states led by Republicans who've taken it seriously have generally fared pretty well. So our schools are open only for half days. Right. Not in all of the state, but I just putting my daughter on the bus was, after months of homeschooling, was one of the great delights in my life so far, I must say.
Well, doubly thank you for doing this. And so the deal is that the schools are now open in Massachusetts half the day.
Some schools, depends on the district, but we have low incidence in our particular area, and so yes. So for elementary schools, half day. There's more detail than you need, but for middle schools, depends on the letter of your name, but you go 2 days. If your last name, is M through Z, you go 2 different days, and then they alternate the 5th day each week. So it's, everybody's doing it in different ways. And the high school is much more remote, mainly remote. So everywhere it's a mess.
And what's happening at Harvard?
That's where I teach. So I teach 3 courses remotely, 500 plus students from this space. And what they've done for undergraduates is they've invited first-year students to campus. This is, of course, the fall of their first year, because otherwise they'll have no way of building community. All the teaching is done remotely for them and for all other students. And then in the spring, the first-year students will depart in principle. We'll see what happens. Maybe we'll have made progress by then. Not so clear that that'll be the case, but the final year students, the 4th year students, will replace them on the logic that it's their senior year and they'll be graduating. This will be their last chance to be with their classmates. So there's a sort of humanity to the logic, but it's just very unfortunate. And for the graduate schools, it's all remote.
God, that's interesting. So we're a long way from anything remotely normal. Listen, Samantha, I'm just going to do a better job of introducing you rather than delving deep into the school and education systems of Massachusetts. We are really grateful to you for joining us, not least because it's the beginning of your day, but specifically because we decided to do this. We're working, as you may know, with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, with the One campaign, with Project Everyone. And in the course of particularly, I think, April and May, it was really striking how people coming onto our thinkings, these open news meetings, and saying, where's the global leadership? And it's a curious thing because people are not normally excited or exercised by multilateralism or the global institutions. And yet this is what you kept on hearing. And so we decided to hold this day-long discussion of what was happening in global leadership. And we were really struggling with what's the extent to which you discuss institutional or political paralysis, and what's the extent to which you just focus on the to-do list. And so far this morning, we've talked about how you develop vaccines, what you do about debt, how you think about equality, how you think about misinformation. But we really wanted to talk to you and get an understanding from you, given your work with President Obama, given your work at the United Nations, but also at Harvard teaching global leadership, what you think. So really, I hope in the course of the next 45 minutes, we'll get a sense from you of what your analysis of the problem in 2020 might be and what your suggestions of what the answer should be. And, you know, I loved your last book, The Education of an Idealist. It's, if you like, the tension at the very heart of what we're doing with Tortoise, which is we go into it with such high hopes and good intentions, and then each day we're buffeted back by the reality of the world. So we hope that you'll bring that idealism and experience to bear. Our thinkings are intended to be really open and like an editorial board, you know, so we hope that everyone will weigh in, they'll share their experience, their point of view. So I'm going to make sure that not only I interrupt you, but a bunch of our people attending online will do that. But would you kick off, if you might, by just trying to answer that big question, which is, why are we seeing such a failure of global leadership when it feels as though it's never been more needed?
Well, I think it's worth, we will talk, I hope, over the course of our time together about sort of the structural forces that are bigger than any one man or any one leader. But it is worth sort of running the counterfactual and saying, okay, if you took the sort of anti-science populists, you know, kind of autocratic, at least in temperament, if not in governing structure, out of the equation, what grade would we give the world? And it wouldn't be great, that's for sure. But for example, the early weeks of mishandling in China, stemming from the culture of fear that exists in a fully authoritarian, way more repressive China even than 5 years ago, you know, where whistleblowers were detained, and notwithstanding, you know, ultimately the way China was able to get a grip on the epidemic, that was lost time that nobody gets back. If you take Trump out of the equation and the downplaying of the virus, the flattery for Xi so deep into it, the pulling out of the WHO at the height of the greatest pandemic in 100 years, you know, every dimension of his leadership that predated COVID, anti-science, anti-expert, anti-global cooperation, it was a kind of perfect misalignment of the leadership qualities, such as they are, that he brought to bear, and the needs in the moment. Even, you know, sort of Mexico and Brazil, the particular leaders with the particular sort of populist impulses, disdain for experts, having come to power, you know, on anti-elitist platforms, and then putting science under that chapeau, under that rubric of elite in a way that's devastating for citizens. So you take out, you know, several 100,000 of the global deaths. So I frame that because, you know, Donald Trump, for example, came to office, winning election, of course, losing the popular vote, but in the Electoral College, eking in by 78,000 votes spread across 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. You know, you run the tape differently in that election, or in the week before the election, or if Hillary, you know, travels to Wisconsin, or the whole series of other things, that path dependencies that put us in the situation where we have somebody who is so ill-suited to this crisis in this moment. And then imagine an America that leads on COVID in the way that it did on Ebola, you know, also just coordinating, you know, everything from vaccine development, but also to support for countries that don't start with the infrastructure and the resources to manage the crisis themselves. You know, so my point is, there's some serendipity in this, some you know, very distinct leadership sort of deformities, I think, that really pervert where we are. And then in terms of structural forces, regardless of who would be in office, for example, in the United States, political polarization is just a killer on all semblance of unity in a crisis. And I mean, we saw this in the Obama years where, we had Republicans who were willing to, who refused to raise the debt ceiling, even if it meant that the US's credit rating on Moody's was going to plummet, as a way of harming Obama and the presidency. Who we had Republicans that were very open that their number one goal was not anything specific to, wasn't even related to taxes or the kind of traditional Republican platforms, but it was about just ensuring that Barack Obama didn't get reelected. So had Hillary won in 2016, were she leading the kind of response that I think we all wish we had, and that would make a big difference, I think, also around the world, she would not be, there would not be a rally around the flag effect. And so that structural divisiveness, which is not just playing itself out here, but in many of the countries where you have these populist leaders, they're coming to power over the objections of half of the country. And even if you saw a return to science and a return to expertise, that the other half is still there, potentially being very divisive. Just not having that unity really harms the kind of solidarity and sort of, a pandemic is the place, it's so diagnostic of whether your society is capable of coming together, whether people can put country and community first. The balance between individualism and communitarianism, all of that is surfaced, and many countries don't fare well.
I'm so interested that you make such a point of the personalities, the individuals in charge. You can spend a life thinking about ideas, institutions, and yet these individuals matter so much. And I was walking around Westminster the other day, we were talking about who has been a genuinely memorable, consequential leader in Europe in our lifetimes. And the only person that my friend and I could think of was Angela Merkel. Right? That actually, when the history books get written 30, 50 years on, people will talk about Angela Merkel. And I know a number of people would ask you, Samantha, whether or not you've named Xi Jinping, Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, Manuel López Obrador, they're all men. And you look at your Angela Merkels and your Jacindas, and the list goes on. And we had a discussion earlier on with Julia Gillard, and we started off by asking the question of whether or not there is something fundamentally different in female leadership. And I'm sure life is more complicated than this, but you must have thought a fair bit about that.
Yeah, I think what you can say is, you go down, you've offered some names, you'd add Taiwan, Finland, Iceland. Feel like we're even forgetting a few more. It's really, really striking. The effectiveness of female leaders, and even, I'm sorry, I keep referring to Trump. You can imagine why, sort of in one's psyche, in one's head, but we do refer to him as Voldemort in my house. So we tend not to use the name, but, even as Trump delights in New Zealand having an uptick, or Australia, he sort of delights in countries where he sees resurgence, kind of relishes that on Twitter in ways that don't do wonders for our soft power around the world. But even seeing how an Ardern handled a resurgence and sort of, again, got on top of it is very striking. I'd offer just a couple thoughts. One, because I'm sure Julie Gillard has covered the terrain quite nicely for your audience, but just to think of what it takes in any one of the countries where women have risen to the top for a female to obtain power at that level. What they have been through. This is not, you don't get to just kind of fall into the chancellorship of Germany or the prime ministership of New Zealand. These are very savvy individuals. They've been effective in most of the countries that we've mentioned in building trust in sort of, and again, they have their detractors, Lord knows. And before COVID, of course, Merkel was having, great difficulty in terms of her domestic standing. But they are, if you're looking for the kinds of tests that would leave you with the fiber to manage a crisis, to have the kind of people skills, plus, as we've seen with Merkel and Ardern and others, that respect for scientific rigor, to get there, it took so much. And that's why we have so few female leaders in the world, proportional to our numbers in terms of population. But the second thing, James, which thrills me as the mother of a daughter who I just put on the bus, is what is the knock-on effect in those countries, and maybe even beyond the borders of the countries where these female leaders have been effective, of it being women who led at this time. I was just reading the Splendid and the Vile, the new Larson book about Churchill and the bombing of London, and it's very different. But for children, not only for girls, but girls and boys alike, to be out of school, to be locked down, to be having to have conversations about death at a young age. And then, for their leader to be the one, in Ardern's case, holding press conferences for kids, deliberately messaging, for that audience. What are the positive cascading effects in the future that we will see of this kind of leadership from women, and the sense of possibility for young girls and what they can do, the sense of normalcy for young boys as they grow up, just thinking not only that this is normal, but maybe adaptive for their societies. But I think that aspect of it, we won't know for a generation or more what difference it made, and maybe the social science will always be very hard to pinpoint. But it's kind of exhilarating to imagine.
I think it'll be a lot. I agree. I think it'll be profound. I'd like to get into the sort of second half of the question, not the individuals, but the organizations that we're looking to in 2020. But before I do, Samantha, what would be great is, I see Vanya F. I call you Vanya F. You sound like, I don't know what you sound like, but it's certainly not your whole name, Vanya. You want to weigh in? I saw your hand was up, and I also saw Alex Poppleton's hand was up, so I want to make sure we can both. Vanya, what was the point you wanted to make?
I wanted to ask a question about the personalities of the leaders today, because when you look at two of the, in fact, some of the world's most powerful leaders today, maybe the Prime Minister of India, the Prime Minister of England, or the President of America, they are always caught making controversial, very controversial statements that keeps them in the news. And I think, like Samantha was saying, that it's about the personality, and that's how they're able to gain the votes. And don't you think that's about time that the wider public gains is more educated within politics and the way politics works, so that way when it comes to the elections, we are able to vote more wisely?
Samantha, do you want to? I'm being told that my voice is very quiet, which, if you know me, is an amazing thing. This almost never happens. So I've just changed the speaker. But do you want to just answer Vanya's point around that point about populism and popular leadership, and what's happening there and why it's happening?
I mean, the point about personality and sort of large personalities, sweeping into office, I think that's right. I guess I would caution a little bit about always equating large personalities with, what we now understand to be sort of the tenets of populism. I think when we now say populism, we're also correlating it with a stirring up of nationalism, maybe some pointing the fingers at particular groups within a society, let's say immigrants or LGBTQ people, as in Poland, or minorities. There's also an anti-feminist strain, I think, to much of the kind of authoritarian-ish, populist-ish, those surges, including in Europe. So there's that. But I mean, you can have a large person. In order to be successful in politics, you have to have a pretty large personality, I think, to begin with. So it doesn't necessarily, Ronald Reagan, was a very popular leader, but he wasn't employing, I mean, there's some questions about certainly how he employed race within the United States, but, he would have, welcomed the United States as a nation of immigrants, whereas, most of the people we're considering populist today have done things like Donald Trump has done, which is actually strip the phrase nation of immigrants, for example, from our US citizenship and immigration service. It's no longer part of the mandate to consider the US a nation of immigrants in that way. In terms of the causes, which is so important to thinking through the remedy, I mean, there's no question that they have fed off the economic grievances that in turn stemmed from jobs disappearing and migrating elsewhere in an era of globalization and more open borders, but also economic inequality, which isn't only happening in democracies. Even as the China model looks very attractive to some of these populist leaders, you're seeing economic inequality alongside the lifting millions of people out of poverty, which is so important in China. But you're seeing economic inequality grow, and political centralization of power and these more autocratic tendencies over time are often coupled with economic centralization in a way that is likely not to be broad-based. So I think that the populist leaders, though, there's a lot of discontent. Trump's difference, for example, was non-college educated whites who had voted for Obama in 2008 and in 2012, and a very small margin of them flipped. But a significant 9% of voters who had voted for Obama in 2012 switched to Trump in 2016, and the majority of them fell into that non-college educated white, and those are the people who've been most hurt, I think, by automation and by jobs again moving elsewhere. James, you're muted, I believe now, so even more quiet.
I'm now unmuted, I think. Can you hear me?
Now we can, yes.
Okay, good. I'm either muffled. We had a very funny thing when I used to work at the BBC. People either were complaining about things that shouldn't be said that are being said, or should be said but can't be heard. And now I know exactly how they feel. Can we get? I'm going to bring Alex in a moment, and Rafiat too on leadership, if I might. But Samantha, can we get to, if you like, the heart of the question? And the question we've asked is, what role can global organizations play in 2020? And I suppose we'd really love to hear, or I would certainly love to hear, your view of whether or not we've built global organizations that in effect don't have a role, that can't play unless those heads of state, heads of government are behind them and are willing to enable them. And if our world is going to be fragmented by a new kind of nationalism, do we need to rebuild global organizations, or do we need to find alternatives to them? How do we get a kind of global coordination that we just don't get right now?
Great. Well, maybe I'll start with the diagnostic, because that's, I think, probably the most helpful. So my starting premise, having worked as U.S. ambassador to the UN for 4 years and worked on UN issues as Obama's UN advisor before that for 4 years, but also having been a citizen my whole life of somewhere, my whole life. But I start where the late great American diplomat Richard Holbrooke sort of left off on this question, which was, and I'm trying to think if there's a British analog to this, James, you'll help me come up with one. But what Holbrooke used to say, being a New Yorker, was that blaming the UN for a crisis is a lot like blaming Madison Square Garden when the New York Knicks play badly. Right. That you're kind of blaming a building, you're blaming the stage on which the actors come together. And that's that idea, and I'm going to quibble with it a little bit as well, but is, I think, consistent with the way you pose the question. Fundamentally, the WHO's performance in this instance really can't recover from having, or talk about what sort of is not, let's put it in a milder way, but it's not exactly built to thrive with Donald Trump, President Xi, Boris Johnson, I mean, you can go, and I mentioned the UK specifically, not just because you're in England, but just because the Brits have played such an important role, and in fairness, funding-wise, continue to in the realm of public health. But it's a very different form of British leadership under Boris than it might have been really with just about any of his predecessors. And so, how could a former Ethiopian health minister and foreign minister, international civil servant, yes, elected by the membership with that legitimacy, but what's he got over President Xi? When President Xi decides he's going to lock up scientists and block a WHO team from visiting, and when they do visit, of course, curb their movements, just as he would curb the movements of Chinese citizens and scientists, what recourse does the head of the WHO have? Well, this is where I guess it's sort of related to Holbrook's point, but it's complicated, and it's where I think hope lies, at least of reform. But whether hope is warranted will depend on who the leaders are and how they choose to act within these organizations. But if you wind back the clock, and it isn't just Tedros who's trying to negotiate with the Chinese government to get access early so as to be able to alert the world even earlier, so as to be able to get the samples and so forth. But if it's Tedros backed by all the powerful member states within the World Health Organization, including and especially the United States, but not only the United States, that pressure on China, may well have been insurmountable for Xi. He may well, but that's not what happened. Like, the U.S. seat on the WHO was vacant, on the executive board was vacant. The civil servants who have been seconded from the CDC and who work at the WHO, until Trump announced last week he's pulling them out. Those civil servants are sending flares to the United States, jumping up and down. But again, you have the broader problem of not respecting expertise, not respecting science, Trump making policy by tweet. So they're just crying out in the wind. And that kind of state-based pressure to complement and reinforce what an international civil servant is doing was completely lacking. And indeed, I think we can go, and this is where my quibbling is very modest, but is to say, I don't think Tedros was as outspoken as he should have been. But if you're him, you're also, looking, I mean, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So it's not that he was doing the right thing and then didn't have backing. I think he did many of the right things, but the pressure also should have been on him.
Right.
And again, that politicizes the leadership of international civil service to an extent that makes some people uncomfortable. But that's why I draw on my experience. That's sort of life in the big city. Fundamentally, Donald Trump's not wrong about Chinese influence within the WHO, but he's wrong to use that as an alibi. If China's having greater influence than the US, which contributes, way more than China does to the organization, has a much longer history and way more expertise within it, that's on the US. That's not on China. That's on us not showing up.
But can I also have a quibble with the Madison Square Garden analogy, which is wonderful. Many people I know will know who Richard Holbrooke was. He was, I think, to put it diplomatically, a muscular individual, right? He was very forceful. And one of the things that I think you hear people say when they complain about global leadership now is that those people in charge of our multilateral institutions, not the ones who are elected as presidents or prime ministers, but the head of the UN, yes, as you say, the head of the WHO, World Bank, IMF, they're too technocratic. They have a platform, but they don't use it. And I wondered what you think of that view.
I think this is where I say, I think there's some truth to it, but often the charge, excuse me, is levied by people who actually aren't aware. So I just offer this as fact for context, who aren't aware that, for example, Antonio Guterres doesn't have a dollar to his name, a policeman, a peacekeeper, a sanction, absent his ability to get member states to provide those goods. So, I mean, one of the shocking and mortifying things about the UN is the extent to which member states micromanage, even his ability to hire an extra, let's say health advisor, let's say the pandemic, and he wants to hire, put somebody on staff who's newly responsible for pandemic coordination. That's got to go through all of the countries within the General Assembly and get that allocation. I mean, the amount of micromanagement kind of embedded, and this is where the rap on the UN as a bureaucracy is justified. But again, it's the member states, including the US, right? Because we're, as the largest donor, always preaching rightly about financial accountability. But what that has produced over the years is a kind of perverted level of micromanagement that just deprives those leaders of the kind of agency that we ascribe to them by virtue of their titles. That said, James, the reason I kind of still agree with the pushback a little bit is that they have the pulpit, and they have the platform that they have, right? They have their voice, and that's where I would say with Tedros, they were really pushing behind the scenes. But I think if you look back on Gro Brundtland and prior pandemics, she came out the gate sooner, was more vocal internationally, arguably more confrontational. That was a different China. China wasn't the #2 donor to the WHO back then. She wasn't, having to game what the consequences would be if she took his marbles and went home. Again, the world is very different now. But I think choosing your moment to give up on backdoor diplomacy is a really important feature of leadership. But Antonio Guterres is spending a very large share of his time trying to figure out how to prevent Donald Trump from pulling funding from so many parts of the UN that offer life-saving support. So now WHO is in the news, and we think, okay, that was completely, how could Trump have done something in the moment? I mean, if you actually think of Trump's rampages against NATO and so forth, he's actually been relatively reticent on the UN as an organization and has never threatened to pull our dues from the UN overall. And in part, that's because there's been an awful lot of handholding and reticence, I think, on the part of Guterres. So that's the devil's bargain that these leaders are doing, is if I speak out, what do I jeopardize, especially from the powerful countries, that could be even life-saving support to countries. That's the kind of calculus they're making.
Okay, I fear or feel as though we've got a whole big conversation to have about this, but there are lots of other people who've got better points than mine. Alex Poppleton, I'm going to come to you. Kristen Wilson, I'm going to bring in a moment too, and Rafiat in a moment as well. And I see that Alice Jameson is here from Welcome. I'd like to bring Alice Jameson as well. But Alex, why don't you go first?
Hi, Samantha. I'm trying to unmute myself. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Great to be able to talk to you. Thank you for being here. I'm really interested in the sort of internal kind of electoral kind of makeup of organization of countries. So in the US, we have the electoral college problem, where someone who hasn't got all the democratic votes gets elected. We have the same problem in the first past the post in the UK, and there are a number of other countries. How do we, and that means we end up with populist leaders who actually don't have the majority of the vote. I mean, that's a kind of function of how British politics work, but it also disenfranchises massive parts of the electorate. Is there, I'd be really interested in what your take is on what do we do about that? Because essentially we have electoral systems that were devised centuries ago that really don't seem like they're fit for the 21st century. I'd love to hear your opinion.
Great. I mean, I have opinions as a citizen. I'm more, an international, that's been my emphasis, but given that everything I care about internationally may go up in smoke if we don't get our domestic house in order, you'll hear, the most seasoned foreign policy professionals who've never dreamed of weighing in on, whether Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. should be states, suddenly having very, very strong and considered views on these questions. And I do think that, as Biden says in running here in this election, just that any hope we have of recovering our standing internationally will turn on whether we're able to address the glaring inequities domestically. That's the foundation for our leadership, to the degree that we can, begin to recover it. So to your question, I guess I'd say, and I really won't go beyond the domain that I know, but I assume there are analogies in the UK and other countries that you have in mind. I'd say, first of all, that there's a lot of path dependency to this as well. Some of the most damaging disenfranchisement or disenfranchising acts have come and have been taken, I suppose you'd say, by the US Supreme Court in 5-4 votes. 5-4 votes that should not be 5-4 votes, because Obama had a Supreme Court seat to fill. But of course, the unprecedented decision was made by Mitch McConnell to not allow him to fill it. And so even though the Supreme Court, I think, on some issues has, John Roberts in particular, our Chief Justice, has pleasantly surprised people with a more sort of less political and more even-handed approach to certain legal issues on voting rights, it's been catastrophic. So there have been cases in our system, even with the backdrop of the Electoral College, that have, created occasions where much of this could be shored up. And you're seeing this in the voting rights space also on all the relevant COVID decisions, are pretty much going, at least from where I sit, the wrong way, where the emphasis is never on, it seems, broadening the electorate or the means by which the electorate can make their voices heard. So there's that. So I just would note that 5-4 is, we'd be in a very different situation, but for Citizens United, but for the Voting Rights Act case, the gerrymandering decision to punt everything back to the states. So, and those are every bit as great a perversions, I think, on the idea of voting rights as the underlying Electoral College challenge, which goes back a few hundred years. Last thing I'd say just is, it even against the backdrop of these, what you could call sort of distortions of the popular will or skewings in some sense, as your question implies, we still have to play politics against that backdrop. Like, we don't get to change the rules without changing them through political engagement. And demographically, and in terms of voter will, at least as reflected in many, many polls, we in the United States, we have the numbers to make great headway and to make great inroads through actually putting in office people who will seek to change the rules. I don't think that will include a constitutional amendment anytime soon. But even in places, again, where the Supreme Court hasn't helped, like Texas, where you have restrictive voter ID laws that allow you to use your gun license, but not your student ID to vote, which are clearly designed to skew toward one subset of the electorate. Well, those are the rules. So what are we doing? How is our excess enthusiasm then translating into getting organized to make sure that students are registering in higher numbers than they traditionally have, that people of color and disenfranchised communities are being informed of what these new strictures are so that they can meet those requirements as they turn up. So, on one level, it's like, this is the world we're in. I do think if you look at Joe Biden's platform and even the debates about the filibuster, and this may be inside baseball, I forgive for those who aren't like in the weeds of American politics, but Joe Biden has been a longtime skeptic of doing away with the filibuster. And that has allowed, even when Democrats have been in the majority, that has allowed Republicans to block the kind of ambitious climate legislation, ambitious, voting rights, refreshed legislation, really going at some of the holes that have been poked in the legislation. Joe Biden is still not saying he's going to do away with the filibuster, but in a major development, Barack Obama came out about a month ago, or maybe a little bit longer now, and said he was urging Vice President Biden to do that if he became president. Those same voting rules that we can't change enable them to take office again. So this is the kind of consequentialism that you have to do in thinking through, whether you do away with, norms or even, rules, or that you use legislation, to create more possibilities of making reform in the near term, but also you make it easier for Republicans to push their agenda through downstream.
Alex, thank you so much. I'm gonna do something, Samantha, if it's all right, which is probably a bit unfair, which is invite Rafia Atanda and Kristen Wilson and Alice Jameson each to put points to you, so we make the most of our time.
Right.
Why don't you go first? Hi there.
All right, thank you so much. Good afternoon, Samantha. Good afternoon, James, and everyone else. My name is Rafia Atanda. I am a one champion reaching your live from Lagos, Nigeria. More than ever, the coronavirus pandemic has shown our vulnerabilities as a people, as a continent, and basically as the world. And I feel like it's very important that world leaders do everything possible to help people get their lives back, because come to think of it, unemployment is on the rise, poverty is eating harder, and more persons are dying because of a lack of vaccine. So the current reality looks gloomy, and more than ever, it is important that we help people to get their lives back. So on leadership, I think it is very important for world leaders to know that the kind of leadership that young people want is an empathetic one, a strategic one, and a people-centered leadership, one that is not hinged on scoring political points and usurping power, but focused on forging strategic partnerships that will improve the lives of the ordinary people. A leadership whose vision is to transform the lives of a people positively, propels it to promulgate and implement people-centered policies, and not the one whose policies add to the suffering of its people. This is not the time for world leaders to, try to steal money or try to make people suffer. It is the time for them to come together and exhibit a kind of leadership a servant leadership, and not the one that personalizes the wealth of the nation to the detriment of common people. So if we really want a better world post-COVID-19, we need to ensure that we are led into a world where everyone will have a life of opportunity and dignity. So this is my submission today. I hope that world leaders are listening, and they know that the kind of leadership that young people want is an empathetic one, one that would strike strategic leadership and partnerships, and one that would make lives better for everyone. Thank you so much.
Rafia, more to the point, thank you. Empathetic, strategic, people-centered. I've written it down. I'm just going to make sure that we hear too from Alice and Kristen. Kristen, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. It's a really great honor for me to ask you this question today, Samantha. So my question was just kind of about talking about global leadership and about narrative. I recall watching a documentary about the end of the Obama administration, and there was a debate between yourself, President Obama, and Ben Rhodes about the kind of tension between a narrative that's about progress and trying to focus on progress and talking about how far we've come, but how that doesn't necessarily always resonate with people and the struggles that we still have and kind of the progress that we still feel like we're lacking. And so I would just be interested in kind of hearing your views about this tension and in the right narrative, especially for this moment, given where we are now.
Brilliant, Kristen, thank you very much. And Alice Jameson, I just wanted to make sure we bring you in, Alice, because you're picking up on a point that, I don't know whether you were on our last session, David Miliband was talking about healthcare, global healthcare as a platform for global organizations. But put your point, Alice, please.
Great, thanks, James. And yes, this is to bring back to what you were mentioning earlier, Samantha, just in terms of the kind of the challenges that organizations like WHO and the UN system more broadly are kind of facing in this new kind of geopolitical environment. And really would be keen to know from your perspective, both to kind of end COVID, but also to be more prepared for future epidemics. What do you think a new kind of multilateralism would look like that would allow that kind of international cooperation? And I think importantly, from a kind of welcome point of view, having focused a lot of this last 6 months trying to raise political support and money for the development and access to COVID vaccines and treatments, really the question is how to take some of those decisions and resources out of those economic and political cycles, so that the next time an event like COVID happens, we are better able as a kind of global community to actually stop that impact from kind of expanding outwards.
Thank you. Samantha, next generation leadership, next generation narrative, next generation multilateralism.
It's great. These are just great comments, great questions. Rafiat doesn't really need much of a response, but I would just take note of how maybe for all of us gathered here, I don't know how much diversity of worldview there is, James, in the community you're building, but a core, there are just several sort of first order core differences, beyond Republican, Democrat, Brexiter, Remainer, smoker, non-smoker, airport person, non-airport, urban, rural. I honestly feel like the sort of major underlying divide, at least that's surfacing in COVID, is those who recognize that our fates are connected to the fates of people who live elsewhere, and those who don't, and you could, the first category, there's a range of ways to view it. It can be very self-interested and sort of, just a view that if you don't deal with the pandemic elsewhere, it comes to you, or, the argument that I make to sort of Trump supporters, which is, you care about restarting the economy, our supply chains stretch into places like Bangladesh. It is in our interest to support Bangladesh, whether through the WHO, and I'll come to Alice's question, or in some other way. So in order to ensure that we can restart the economy can return to normal, which is what we need. We, not just these, kind of spasms of recovery, but something more systemic around the globe is going to require dealing with COVID everywhere fundamentally. It's not very persuasive, because if you fundamentally sort of just, again, have this underlying view that you can isolate yourself, it's the essence of, kind of an isolationism or a nationalism, or that your strength is such that you can kind of override that connectedness, you're just not going to do a whole bunch of things. And so you can view it as Rafiat has, in terms of empathy and a sense of global solidarity, or, I come from Ireland originally, I'm an immigrant to America. And for whatever reason, often, even when I was representing the US, have a kind of there, but for the grace of God, go I, view from being a journalist in Bosnia in my early 20s and seeing people who listen to the same music as me and wore the same clothes as me, and suddenly they're being ethnically cleansed, and just imagining that kind of thing can happen. And what would I wish someone who was in a more comfortable situation would do in such circumstances? That sort of is where I land in that kind of, we're all connected, but it's a major issue. And I don't know exactly how, or at least I think we haven't cracked the code on how to reach people. People make fun of Trump in saying you can build a wall and you can do this, but it really is kind of the right metaphor for that other view, that you can separate yourself from the fates of others. So I think, Rafiat, the way you put it, as James captured, I think is powerful, but it's so contested, so surprisingly contested, given that it's just factually the case that we are connected by airplanes and air and emissions and climate and so forth. The last thing I'd say to Rafiat is, I know Nigerian politics are pretty forbidding, but you'd be a hell of a politician or a community leader of some kind. I'm sure you already are, but it's part of the challenge is, how do we attract young, visionaries like you into the mix when we know that there are many people in elected office and in other civil service positions around the world who don't have that sense of common security, common humanity that was reflected in your comment. The question about the final year. First, let me offer a plug for this movie that was done. We Greg Barker, the great filmmaker who was London-based for many years, got full access basically to the Obama administration the last year, and just trailed us around, and really I think offers probably the best insight into the breathlessness and foibles in many ways and deliberations of diplomacy. So I think it has a kind of evergreen quality. It happens to make people who aren't crazy about President Trump very sad. So I have to put a smoker's warning on the film, because it sort of transports you. It's like, people who used to believe in science and who failed at things, but where it wasn't about whether they were going to make money themselves out of, doing a diplomatic deal. It was actually about the diplomatic deal and whether it would work. So it's not a rosy portrait, but I think there's an integrity to the spirit that's captured. And Kristen puts her finger on this timeless question of how you meet people where they are. And the argument that she's alluding to was effectively between me and Obama, Ben Rhodes being with Obama, where he was trying to meet people where they are and say, it's just not as bad as it feels right now. Like, yes, freedom is in decline. Yes, China's on the march, though that wasn't his word, but there are climate changes worsening by the minute. Yes, all of that is true, but let's take a broader sweep. And his view, I think, and not without reason, is that hope is fuel. That without hope, if you live in this dark place, and you're so alert to everything that is broken, you're not exactly going to do the kinds of things that we talked about in the exchange about democratic politics and elections and people movements, and you're not going to take Rafiat's worldview, and push for it day to day. So that I think was his view. My view was and remains on one level is yes. And I mean, what's to disagree with what I just said? But if you blow past if you're seen to be blowing past where people are, they feel unseen. And it's almost like a dignity point, right? And I think that there may have been at least something to this view in that Obama-Trump voter shift, right? Of people who were like, I keep hearing, it's a little bit like what Trump keeps making the mistake of doing on the stock market. I keep hearing how great the stock market is. What the hell does that have to do with my ability to buy insulin for my kid, and the fact that healthcare premiums are going way up? So I think finding that balance of just meeting people where they are, and then finding some other means maybe of generating hope, like pointing to examples in the moment where through civic action, people have made a difference. Black Lives Matter protesters, and how already the conversation has been transformed about policing in this country. Joe Biden's platform on climate, which is way different than he started with by virtue of the climate activists, particularly the young people who have driven. And so I think finding that balance of meet people where they are, make them feel seen, where their pain is not blown past. And I'm not saying, again, I don't think Obama did blow past it, but that was what the debate was about. It was about how to find that sweet spot, which is even more important today. And then lastly, which I think has been James's question that he's been trying to get me to answer throughout, which is about the international system and kind of where we go from here. I mean, I do have this sort of statist mentality that we don't get any satisfactory answers, or we don't get the answers we need on international institutional reform, multilateral reform, without changing, without investing in domestic politics and changing who our leaders are. There are exceptions, like in terms of working, like President Xi is leader for life, right? And so I actually think one of the ways in which China gets affected, particularly in this period before there's new leadership from the US, I think we've already seen kind of coalitions of democracies led by Macron and Merkel and Morrison from Australia, who initiated the effort to get World Health Organization investigation into COVID. Like you're seeing after 4 years of Trump, or almost 4 years of Trump, the democracies that had gotten a little used to the US being kind of the, pickup game, like the team captain, saying, okay, you do this, we'll do this, you now see, because that's leadership is totally absent. It wasn't loved ever anyway, but there is a kind of passivity that may creep in over the years. And you now see, democracies hustling and being more outspoken, trying to take initiatives of their own, trying to isolate China. It's challenging without the United States. I mean, just China has so much economic leverage to bring to bear to push back against the kinds of reforms that might be needed. But so those are my answers. Domestic politics, invest in those, get leaders who believe that our fates are connected and that we need stronger international institutions. Irrespective of what happens in America, coalitions of democracies or of those with shared values. I do think one of the things that has happened that I didn't even know about until recently is that the Global Fund for HIV, TB, and malaria has really effectively been repurposed as a kind of arm of the international health architecture. And remember, the Global Fund was created back in the day, again, with the need to get antiretrovirals to people. That infrastructure is what has been used in many developing countries to now get PPE, and eventually will be used to get vaccines to people. I think thinking through, how that meshes with the emergency, what we've seen in crisis after crisis to as yet not be the satisfactory emergency crisis response arm of the WHO, what can be done in between. I also think, despite my statism, which is a bit of an incurable condition, it seems, I like Bill Gates has done more on COVID and more for people, than the United States has up to this point. And so the statism of these international institutions, where the boundaries between the philanthropists and civil society and business, on the one side, and states who are the grown-ups and they're at the kiddie table, somehow like that also is not fit for purpose in the 21st century. So thinking through how to break down those barriers, whether within the WHO or, again, if it is too statist to move, right, then you will start to, and we've already seen this in other domains, but looser networks and coalitions growing up, which will take advantage of civil society and the private sector, being in more places than governments or international agencies will reach, and being able to move more quickly precisely because of some of the bureaucracy and the state micromanagement that may be a perennial curse for these, long-standing international bodies.
All right. Well, Samantha, firstly, a big thank you to Alice and Kristen, to Rafiat, because I think in that series of answers, actually we got a sense, Samantha, it was a real privilege to get to hear that, partly because it actually leaves me rather optimistic. You're either going to see states and domestic politics step in, or if that doesn't work out, you're going to see civil society and the private sector step in. Both ways, there's going to be a stepping in. Listen, thank you for your time. It really is great to hear from you. If you haven't read Samantha's books, do. I say that with some heart. I think one of the reasons that I continue to believe in journalism was Samantha's reporting, as she said, from Bosnia, A Problem from Hell. And the idea of bystanding, the idea of watching terrible things happen and doing nothing about it, is one of, I suppose, been one of the sort of motivating ideas that's captured my imagination and made me think about journalism ever since. You have the capacity to do these things where you sometimes just put your finger on what's happened. And I hadn't heard anyone make the point that you made, which is there's a division today between those who recognize that our fates are connected to those who live elsewhere and those who don't. And I know there's a simplicity to that as well, but understanding connectedness, I think, is one of the great tasks of 2020. So Ambassador Power, Samantha, thank you very much for your time. It's been great to hear from you. We can't applaud you. We can say thank you. And actually, you're seeing some people applauding, and Abdullah's applauding you from the WFP. So thank you very much indeed. Do stick around. We're going to go directly into the next session, which is on food security. Please make sure everyone sticks with us. In the meantime, a big thank you to you, Samantha.
Thanks, James. Great to see you again.
Okay.